Okay, so we are now on chapter 8, progress. Uh, the opening quotes have been, I think, instructive and informative every time, and this one's no different. The arc of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Theodore Parker, 1853. We have multiple sections that harken back to this original quote, which was very famously used by Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech. But its overarching message has now seemingly been adopted, if not wholesale, then I would say very deeply across our Western culture. That was. Everybody's okay. Um, so progress is kind of considered a general good within our contemporary society, if not a moral good. And that is, again, somewhat unquestioned. It might have been noteworthy to get some of the ancient perspective that this concept of progress as either being a moral good or inexorable was not held by the ancients. There was more of a sense of the greatness of the past that now needed to be recaptured somehow or aspired to. So it wasn't that the future was where progress was going to occur. It was kind of the Edenic, Eden-like, or glorious past that you either wanted to re-achieve or you could never achieve, but you looked back to with, I don't know, nostalgia maybe, or fondness, or it's not something that I would have necessarily thought of. It's not something.
How far back do you reckon they're thinking about this?
I have a sense that it is kind of a time immemorial sort of thing where you're talking about the mythical stories of your culture. So there's not a specific date. So the mythic story of the founding of Rome, either with Romulus and Remus, the two, twins nurtured by a wolf, or Aeneas, who survives the Battle of Troy and winds up kind of migrating and winding up in the Italian peninsula. But those are not viewed by the Romans with specific dates. It's more like just these founding myths about the past, in the same sense that the Greek mythologies weren't concrete time periods. When Zeus was coming down to seduce a woman and produce a hero, or the Titans were clashing with the Greek gods. It was just the past. That's kind of my sense of it. And the way that cultures, almost every culture has something it harkens back to. We come from such and such a place or such and such a group. Why are we here now? And that's extra tricky in America where everyone is from somewhere else. But even in these, kind of considered ancient cultures, they have beliefs about where they come from too. Interestingly enough, I've heard, I've done no real study on this, that China has no founding myths. In their oldest, like folk tales and the histories of China, China already exists. You know, that it talks about some deeper time period, but China was always there. And it's just kind of an interesting way to think about it like this, you know, sort of eternal kingdom or whatever. But you know, regardless, we take without question the issue that we've brought up multiple times with different chapters, but the commercial element of new and improved, that it goes together unquestioningly. If something is new, that means it's better than whatever was old. Now that is, again, that's somewhat unquestioned, I would say, but that's not a universal, obvious understanding. As a matter of fact, I think despite the, you know, mercantile appeal of getting us to buy new consumer products, we could probably all come up with a few things that were better before. This is an interesting one. But if you will, they have like pictures and charts of this online. It's actually sort of interesting. But when you look at lumber, the measurements of standard lumber, even just within America, so you're talking about like 200-year span, and just how much smaller things are. Like, if you don't work with lumber, you don't know that a 2x4 is not actually 2x4. We call that it's referred to as a nominal measurement, but like a 2x4 piece of wood, like a stud board at Home Depot, is actually 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And even then, if you were to take a caliper to it, you know, something like a micrometer, I'm not so sure we're even going to meet that anymore. I mean, they shrink it all the time. That's actually become that's a phrase that I just came across a couple of years ago, shrinkflation, where you know, basically the product, especially food that you would get at the store, it's the same price, but it's smaller. Like that candy bar is 20% smaller than it used to be, but it's the exact same price, if not more. The bag of chips, same price, but it has more air in it, and there's fewer chips inside. Ice cream is a big one. It seems like since the earth cooled, ice cream has been sold in the half gallon. And now it's not. The shape is the same, except it's like smaller, but it's got like the same proportional dimensions. It's a box, or it's kind of a tub or whatever, but it's a little smaller. So, and that's the way you know, companies have been trying to, you know, either save a few dollars or earn a few dollars by charging the same for less product. So, we could look in those terms and say new is not improved. We're not going the right direction here. But I think in a general sense, we assume that if you come up with a newer version of something, there's a reason for it. Now, sometimes the reason is because it's cheaper to produce or whatever it is, but in a general sense, I think we assume. If you redo something or remake something, you make it a little better than it used to be. Otherwise, why do it in the first place? But that sense of why do it, I think, is sort of wrapped up in this sense of progress. The future is better. Now, going to be better. It's going to be better, but in essence, it is better. I mean, that's not a statement of fact, but it's just sort of an existential decision we make. The future is better because number one, anything is better than now, because we always have a complaint that we hope will be resolved or somehow improved in the future. But remember again that the future is our imagination. It doesn't actually exist, at least not in a manner in which we can actually connect to. The past, we at least can access memories of. We can discover artifacts about. But the future, the undiscovered country, though we can posit, like all of our time and all of our lives, is true and real within the presence of God, we're not a part of it. Like that, our conception of time means that however it's flowing, we can look backwards, we experience the present, the future, though we take educated guesses, though we can try to think through it as well as possible or take a faithful, position, it's still our imaginations more than anything else.
Hurricane going.
We don't know. And what's going to happen when the power goes out? I don't know. How long is it going to be out? I don't, all of these things are really our imaginations. And now that makes it sound more fanciful than it maybe is, but it is sort of our experienced reality that we are always imagining what we think is going to happen in 5 minutes, 5 years, whatever. And again, I think we have put ourselves in a position of assuming progress. There, especially with the economic shifts over the last several years, many of which are, COVID related, but also, after the housing bubble in 2008, housing prices have gone through the roof. There's all this talk about, these younger generations are so disaffected because they can't afford rent, let alone a mortgage, a pair of, working spouses, even in the early 90s could afford a home to raise a family in. And now, what two 26-year-olds getting married could afford a home. So there's a lot of talk, just sort of that general malaise of, this generation is, this is the generation that won't be better off than their parents. Like the expression of the American dream, every generation is going to be a little bit better off. But what happens when that doesn't occur? And it seems very, very disruptive, very shocking even. It's a big problem, as opposed to if every generation was just sort of, you never knew, it wouldn't necessarily seem so upsetting. If the next generation was having a difficult time in a way that a prior generation didn't, well, maybe the generation after that will do better than they will. I mean, who knows? But that's not the way we approach it. We approach it, I think we just sort of a fundamental assumption that we will be able to provide a little more comfort, a little more ability, a little more resources to our children than we received, and then they will in turn to their children, and then their children, and things will get better. Things will build, things will grow. But what happens when that doesn't occur? So we conflate, I think, progress in technology with progress in morality, or even progress in humanity. And those are different things. I think they can work together, but I don't think they have to work together. That would be a little bit back to C.S. Lewis's chronological snobbery, that, because the ancient Romans didn't have electricity, they were stupid. They were dumb. Not just they didn't have the technologies that we did, but like they were very childlike in their understanding. That's been a very easy criticism of miracles in the Bible or the gospel story itself. It's like, oh, sure, the incarnation is because of Mary and the Holy Spirit. Wink. We moderns know where babies come from, so we wouldn't be as gullible as the first century people would to think that, clearly she just messed around on Joseph and this was a cover story, but whatever. People a long time ago, they didn't understand these things. Well, first century people absolutely knew where babies came from. Sorry. They're not stupid. They don't understand maybe the biology behind it in a way that we do. with information that is, not just deeper, but more widespread. But they absolutely and positively knew where babies came from and were just as shocked by the concept that Joseph was not the father and there was no human father. That was as miraculous then as it is now. I will not name the name of this particular bishop, but he wrote several cantankerous books that would involve statements such as, this won't be a direct quote, but this is the gist of it. Modern man can flip a switch and turn on a light. So clearly, we don't believe in the miracle stories of the Bible.
Okay.
And it's such a complete non sequitur. That somehow the technological process of electricity, electrified homes, lighting, easy switches and stuff like that, somehow carry the freight of the human understanding of reality. We are in some ways morally better than our predecessors, and we are in some ways morally worse off. Every age seems to pick and choose its virtues that it appreciates more than others. Every age seems to let the pendulum swing in one direction or the next on a topic, but it's never one pendulum. Morality is never just one thing. It feels like an infinite number of pendulums for an infinite number of moral questions. And some ages have a pendulum here and here and here and here and here. And then as the next age comes, all those pendulums start swinging in the opposite direction. And you can't just say, oh, this is a good time, this is a bad time, good people, bad people. The complexity of a single human person, let alone a society with all of its various moral quandaries, how we approach that. Every age kind of picks and chooses what it prioritizes in its own slight ways. Now, I'm not going to argue that some of these moral questions don't have a better answer today than they used to. I will suggest, though, that number one, I'm not positive that it's unique to our time that issue has been answered in a certain way. Like, pick any current societal sort of, we've experienced progress because 150 years ago, women didn't have the vote in America. So through suffrage, and now not only are women able to vote, but they are represented at, almost every level of, the government. And we have now had 2 women run unsuccessfully, but run and become very close to becoming the president of the United States. We have women on the Supreme Court. So we could identify that as progress in that sense, even a moral progress with the dignity of every human being, that your sex is not precluding your full participation in the citizenry. But is that wholly unique in human history to right now? And the question to that is, I don't think so. There are examples of matriarchal societies in history. They're uncommon, but in their own way, were the sexes equal in law and authority? Maybe. Were the women, did they have the advantage at some point in some places? Maybe. So I don't know that that's necessarily saying and we were the first to fix it all. But there's some things that I think we can pick and say, yes, this is better. This is better. We don't seem to like, and this is a contemporary ethic. This is a contemporary virtue. We don't like making moral distinctions that suggest someone else is wrong unless we want to. And that sounds like a whole lot of nothing, but we, through a multicultural society, there's a sense of, oh, all cultures are equally valid, all viewpoints, and, it's your opinion, and we have to respect that. But then you kind of pick the wrong topic and people can come down pretty hard like a ton of bricks. No, you're absolutely positively wrong. You're wicked for thinking you're evil. You can't, such things can't be said in polite society, or you're a Nazi, or, whatever it is. So it's just interesting. We're, everything is open and accommodating, and we are all, deeply inclusive until we're not. And I would say that is a kind of contemporary virtue of society. We are no judgments. Everyone has their own moral compass until it's like your own ox that's being gored. And then you've got a real strong opinion and the other person's absolutely positively wrong. So I think progress is kind of a little bit of a mixed bag there. It is not the same thing to have a technological process and assume that's making us better people. And this is where I differ a little bit on this chapter, only because it kind of didn't come up. And I get a little twitchy when progress is described as an unalloyed good for a couple of reasons. I don't dispute anything that he's written in this chapter. I think everything is basically correct, but there's a couple of things I thought could have been mentioned that feel sort of significant to me. Number one is, again, back to C.S. Lewis, his definition of progress always involved going the right direction. Moving forward it's not true progress if you're going in the wrong direction. Right? So just like we're moving forward. Okay, yeah, but if you're going the wrong way, that's not progress. So how you define progress, how do you identify progress is something that kind of got glossed over a little bit. And the other thing is what does not or has not progressed, which I think is also a significant factor to consider. Despite our societal progresses, our moral progresses, even our technological process, I'm not convinced that humanity itself has changed. I'm thinking that people are still people. Mm-hmm. And human nature itself does not seem to progress. It just seems to change. But even the change is not, I don't know how substantial it is. It kind of moves around in funny ways and circles around and does oddball things. But I'm just not convinced that our essential humanity is markedly different. What we do is obviously influenced by our current culture, by our technology, by all these other things, but our capacity for gracious sacrificial love and horrific, selfish, diabolical destruction seems to be the same as it was 100 years ago and 10,000 years ago. I just don't know that element of progress, because I think it sort of gets presupposed. Even moral progress sort of presupposes that our humanity itself is progressing. And if you, we see less of this now, but it was real popular in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But science fiction would suggest like, oh, humanity is going to continue to evolve. And like we would get these sci-fi stories or movies or whatever about, future man, and his brain is very large and he's very peaceful, and you get some of these kind of odd presuppositions or guesses about how our bodies would change, how our minds would change, how society would change in the future because we're going to progress so much. And that kind of harkens back to a long time ago. I mean, you can remember stuff like H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where he takes it into the future and the society is kind of bifurcated into the super peaceful Eloys and the kind of creepy underground Morlocks. But like this is because we've progressed so far. Um, Star Trek, at its heart, from the beginning, from the 60s, has always had this hopeful utopian view of the future. Like after a few centuries, we figure this stuff out. You know, we figure out racism and fix it. We figure out sexism and fix it. We figure out famine and hunger and injustice and we fix it. We figure out all these things that they were looking at in the 60s as contemporary societal problems. And they said, well, let's jump ahead 400 years and assume we have all that fixed. What's next for humanity? And what's next would be exploring, going where no man has gone before kind of stuff. Like that will be the next adventure, because after humanity solves its current problems, it will then want to explore. You know, why do you climb the mountain? Because it's there. What's the next challenge? The societal challenges have been resolved. So that's why Star Trek in particular always had kind of a very specific vision. It was very hopeful. Other sci-fi properties, especially ones like 70s science fiction, was all dystopian. Soylent Green and Logan's Run, Planet of the Apes. You know, the future was dire because we were going to ruin things and stuff was only going to get worse. So I'm just not sure that human nature itself progresses in that sense to become something different than it is. If there is progression within our human nature, I would suggest it is the process of divine sanctification. It's theosis. It is us becoming more like God, not, you know, this earthly evolutionary perfection. I'm kind of thinking that humanity is still humanity.
Yeah, it is. My mother used to tell me that. Human nature.
Yeah, people are people. People are people. And that's not to say we don't have plenty of differences and unique and quirks and stuff like that. But I think I'm kind of back to that Aristotelian sense of accidents and essences, that there is way more in common that we have with each other than it is this different. Especially in the sense of what makes us us. So anyway, back to being able to talk a little bit more about progress. There is a presumption, and this has come up. That phrase has been used a lot about the right side of history. We've been hearing that for 20 years, especially in political debates. Whatever the political issue of the day is, it's that phrase, the right side of history, seems to be used as dispositive. Like, clearly the answer to this problem is X. And, you know, history will judge you harshly for not agreeing. We're on the right side of history. And that is an interesting statement. It's rhetoric. It's not logic, because it assumes that we know the future, which we don't. We're imagining it, however accurate those imaginations happen to become, but it is an imaginative thing. So how do you know what history is going to, which history, where, when, who? Is there going to be a meeting? Is there a committee? Are the historians going to get together and vote? What about the ones that disagree with the vote? Is the vote close? Is it like 51-49, or is everybody unanimous? That it's a rhetorical flourish that really doesn't have a lot of meaning and content, but it's really trying, it's an emotional appeal. You don't want to be the bad guy, right? Well, you think you're doing the right thing, but if you keep doing what you're doing, one day you'll look back on it and regret it. And I think, and I'm not going to say, I think the issue has been used in the past. Like, history will judge us for these decisions kind of stuff. I think that's always sort of been around at some point, but I think it really accelerated as a more common argument after the civil rights movement. It is truly disturbing to see some of the pictures of like school integration, Ruby Bridges and Brown versus Board of Education and the Arkansas National Guard, like walking little girls through crowds of people who are yelling and screaming and spitting. And they've captured some of these images that are pretty famous where you have, I mean, what is she, like 6 years old or something? And you can see in the faces of people in the crowd, fury, like just contorted rage on their face as they are screaming stuff at a little girl. Now, we can all assume how we will act in a future dilemma or in a crisis or whatever. I wasn't there. I don't think anywhere you were at that particular moment, but you guys at least lived through some of that. It's difficult for me to understand what motivates someone to act so badly. But again, we can look at that and we can look at it with not just regret, but horror to say, man, I never want to look that way on a future photograph as I'm yelling about something that I thought was super important at the moment, but it turns out that I was wrong or that I've changed my mind or whatever it is. But then what happens, like, is every issue of that severity, is every disagreement like the person who's flipping out over a 6-year-old? Some of these very extreme examples, I think, rightly give us pause. Like, I don't want to do that. But is everything going to look like that in the future? Or were those kind of extreme examples that we can say, we're not going to do that, but we can disagree about other things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that. The word, the epithet Nazi within the last 10 years has just exploded in popularity, whereas 10 to 15 years ago, it was seen as a conversation ender. There was actually in the early internet days, with a little bit more Wild West feel, but Godwin's law was applied. So the actual technical part of Godwin's law said something like, the longer an online conversation goes, or an online disagreement goes, the probability of someone being called a Nazi approaches 1 or something like that. But the idea was Godwin's law was applied to say, whenever the first person who brings up the Nazis had lost the argument, because that was very clearly a cheap shot that meant you had no more real arguments left. It's just like calling somebody a name. So if you were disagreeing and it got sort of heated, but you're going back and forth, the first person who said, oh yeah, so is your mother, okay, you lost. That's, we should just all kind of shake hands at that point, because clearly you've run out of steam. And that was the idea. But now it is, calling people fascists and Nazis is just sort of the thing you do. And that seems really pretty horrific if you think about it. This chapter kind of reminds us of a few things. And it was I thought it was a very interesting point, and very, very kind of profound in a shaking manner, that the 20th century lost the positive vision of morality through Christ, through heaven, through discipleship, through sanctification. but it gained the negative example of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, of Nazism. So this sort of phrase kind of came a few times, like, we don't know what to judge as far as what we're aiming for in the good, but we now know the evil to avoid. Now, that's not nothing. I think there is something to be said for that. Like, we have seen terrible things, and we can judge that. We can still say that's terrible. We are not so completely adrift in our moral wanderings that we can't identify something that's terrible. But what happens when that's all you have left? You can avoid the giant pit of despair, but you still have no aim to where you're going. That's where the concept of progress gets called into question, because how do you know you're progressing if you don't know where you're going? If you don't know that where you're going is the right direction, if you don't know what right is. And that does, it really gets kind of mixed into this entire chapter. As we talk about the horrors of the 20th century, it seems so oddly juxtaposed to our technological advances and to our societal advances, which we can probably agree, less racism is a good thing, less sexism is a good thing, less, more laws that are preventing child abuse, good thing. Child labor laws, good thing. I think there's these good elements of progress that we can point to, but that's happening at the exact same time where more people are being killed, murdered, shot, exterminated than happened in human history, probably combined, just within that one century. That is a really insane juxtaposition. And I think I brought this up last week about the 20th century had fewer conflicts, but they were far bloodier. So is that a good trade-off? Like, less warfare in the sense of fewer wars happening, because earlier in society, there were constant small wars all the time, everywhere. And we kind of have stopped doing that. For the most part, at least the countries that we actually pay attention to, war is seen as nobody wants to do that. That's why, like, Russia and Ukraine still seems so shocking to everybody. Like, no, they're not really going to do anything. Remember a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, whenever this started, there were reports like, oh, the Russians are massing here, and the satellites are picking up this and that. But they're just like, come on, but they're not really going to do anything. This is what you do. You kind of posture and you sort of threaten, and then you work all this stuff out. It's been over a year now between the war between Hamas and Palestine and Israel. And when I was in Israel in 2018, I was in Jerusalem when Hamas shot rockets into South Israel, because it happens all the time. And as a matter of fact, while we were in the old city, there was like this big news story that happened. We had to read in the paper the next day, where Israeli commandos went over the border and they kidnapped the perpetrator of some kind of bad thing, and they brought him back over. And it was like this kind of a big deal. But there we are. Israel's not big. So we're not all, we're 100 miles or so away from it, but we never noticed. And we were told, look, Hamas sends rockets in weekly, but they don't go anywhere. Everybody kind of knows nothing's going to happen. It's just it's like pouting. It's like a temper tantrum. It's like, hey, don't forget that we're here and we're mad at you. But it never actually amounted to anything. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. And it seems so shocking that it would actually escalate to that level. We don't do that anymore, right? Aren't we all so afraid of nuclear war that nobody actually does this anymore? Aren't we also afraid that because all of our weapons are so deadly and so dangerous, and everything can be so widespread, that we don't actually Cold Wars, that's where it's at, where we can kind of send spies over and we can poke at you and we can do all these little secret things that make your life miserable, but we should fight wars, right? That's too dangerous anymore, except what happens when it does. And we do live in a time where even if there's just the one conflict, there could be a truly horrific death toll. I say the countries we pay attention to because there are wars going on in countries that people are not paying attention to. People want to point to the conflict, especially Israel and Hamas, and talk about how terrible it is, and it pales in comparison to some things happening in other countries across the world. But nobody's paying attention to those. They're not popular, they're not interesting, they're not Western, they're not white. I don't know why. But some of these places are having, tens of thousands, 100,000 people massacred. And if you don't live in the area, nobody notices. Nobody notices. At least we all don't notice. So this is this kind of terrible juxtaposition of things getting better and things getting worse somehow all at the same time. At the heart of modernity, and this is one of the reasons why, whether they're historians, social psychologists, whether they're just the people who sort of study such things and label such things, no longer consider us a modern society, but a postmodern society, or potentially something past that, in the same way that we might call, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Age. Well, the modern age is a time period that's categorized by a few distinctive points. We use modern and contemporary in the same way, but they actually mean sort of different things. I try to be kind of precise with that, and I try not to use the word modern very much because it really is intended to mean basically like mid 1800s industrial revolution period into probably around the 60s or 70s. That's the modern era. And starting sometime maybe in the 80s, we've moved to something that's different. And this is one of the hallmarks of modernism, which is why it's generally considered that that we're in a different time period. The modern framework was science and industry will fix it all. We are coming up with the solutions to life itself. And in this technological progress, we are going to solve all the world's problems. So when you go back to around 1900 or, a few decades, plus and minus, there is this huge sense of optimism that the machines that were being created, the industrial processes are being created, the discoveries that were coming up, we were figuring it out. We're figuring it all out. Whether it's Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution that gets mentioned in the chapter, we figured it out. We got it. But also a sense of, eugenics in the first part of the 20th century was this huge movement of we were going to prevent the undesirables from reproducing, and we were going to let only the elites, the smartest, the brightest, the most capable produce, and we will have this superior society. And it eventually grows into horrors like genocide, but it was super popular in all parts of society, the first couple of decades of the 20th century. It was, they would have lectures on this, very respected people, politicians would say these things. It was sort of crazy to think about. You got to the 60s, especially in the, kind of that space age time, and there was this sense of the utopian future is right around the corner. You're going to live in a push button society where you are going to lead this life of leisure because all of the tasks, all the drudgery was going to be alleviated by machines. Ladies, you will have a washing machine that will wash the clothes for you. What are you going to do with your time? You will then be able to pursue the higher arts of life because the drudgery of housework, because we've invented this vacuum cleaner and a refrigerator that keeps the food longer, and this oven cooks the food faster, and the washing, and a dryer. You don't have to hang clothes on the line. Your life will be luxury and ease.
I agree.
Well, but that's just it. Back in the 50s and 60s, when these things were first being invented, and we're seeing this huge technological push, utopia was around the corner. So that was modernity. That was the hallmark of modernity that said, we are figuring it all out. We can figure it out, and we are figuring it out. And at some point, that pushed up against the reality of, not really. No matter how much we might progress in certain things, it feels like other things are either not progressing at all, or
Moving backwards.
as we're approaching something, we approach as an asymptote. There is no way to actually finish. So this is is this Heron's paradox or Archimedes' paradox or somebody's paradox, somebody famous in the ancient world. But from here to the door, you see how far I am? If I stopped and started and I always went halfway to the door, how long would it take me to approach to get to the door? And the answer is, I would never get to the door. If you're only going halfway, the distances get infinitesimally smaller, but you never actually reach it. That is the nature of an asymptote, where the curve approaches the line but never touches it. Back from our geometry days. We never hit perfection, but as we get closer, we find that our progress really slows down, and that can become very frustrating. When you first start off, oh, I'm going to go halfway between here and the door. I traveled a lot, but then in a few minutes, I'm only going to be taking tiny, tiny, tiny movements forward, which feels like, what happened? You know, we were on the moon in the late 60s. Shouldn't we be on Mars by now? Should we be in a different galaxy by now? Like, what happened? But this technological progress, but also this sense of a moral progress. We have never had as equitable of a society as we have right now. Never. Not in America, never. But we have people who are just in panic that society has never been worse, or that their oppression has never been sharper. But it just doesn't correspond to any way that we can observe and measure. It's a feeling. And I'm not dismissing the feeling. I'm saying this is what happens in an asymptote. As you get closer to something, you see the flaws close up, but you realize you're not getting any better. And it feels worse somehow, because you remember when things seem to move a lot more quickly. And now, why is it stalled? This is seeing it so tantalizingly close, but never being able to finish feels worse somehow. I liken it to, I've only used one like as a novelty, but like a makeup mirror is a convex or concave? I always forget, but it's like a magnifying mirror. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's supposed to, like, you see the reflection, but it's like way up. And I remember looking at one and you're like, nobody really wants to see their skin that close.
Yeah.
It magnifies all the flaws. And I guess the thought is if you're applying makeup, you want to see the flaws so you can fix them or something, but it looks fine until you're like this close and suddenly like, oh my gosh, this looks crazy. So there's some element to that. Like, the closer you get to something, the more magnified the flaws appear, because you're close enough to see them. From a further distance, it seems very manageable. But as you get really close, those last little cracks seem like giant canyons. This has been kind of dour on my take on progress, whereas I think Glenn Scrivener is still trying to hold out hope that progress is a moral good and it is the arc of history. And I don't want to discount any of that. It's just I always feel very mixed when we talk about progress without unpacking how complicated I think it really is. We should progress. I want us to progress. And I think that what has been so accepted about society, he is 100% right. It is our gospel mindset that people have forgotten that even encourages us that progress is possible, it is desirable, and we are working for a reason. It's just without the guiding light, even if we're all in agreement that progress is good and right, how do we know we're really progressing? So this is where it gets kind of tricky and where it gets kind of complicated. And because so many have forgotten where this ethic originated, we now no longer have a target at which we're aiming, which is, of course, the surest way to miss is by not knowing what the target actually is. But the target changes. Well, it kind of depends on what we're defining here, but if we are defining progress in its largest and grandest sense of morality, then we are talking about something that I think can be a target, which is the humanity that God intends. Our lives looking like the life of Christ, our humanity redeemed and sanctified, humanity as it ought to be, and on earth as it is in heaven. But if we've lost that vision, we have no common language to even describe it, let alone identify it. Then it becomes, what are you progressing toward? Well, I like this and I like that. Well, I prefer this, but that's wrong. You know, that's part of the moral confusion that I think calls progress in general into question. It's good that we're saying we're not doing this terrible thing that we've all agreed is terrible. But where are we going? That seems to be a lot trickier these days.
To get agreement.
Yeah. Yep. Anything else?
Trial and error.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when we're talking about the big moral questions of life, trial and error feels a lot like got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And what happens when those eggs are people?
Yeah.
In the millions.
Okay.
Anything else? All right. I am for progress. I'm sorry. I'm a downer about this. It's just a matter, I think, of this is a complicated issue, but it's a complicated issue because we complicate it. If everyone who agrees that progress is a good idea, that we do want better for all of us and for future generations still to come, regaining that sense of why we believe that progress is good, that origin of the nature of humanity, the created, intended purpose of God,
Yeah, exactly.
then real progress might actually be possible because we finally have a target at which we can aim and not just shoot the arrow and wherever it lands, start drawing a bullseye around it, because that's kind of how it feels. Okay. All right. We will not be meeting next week because of the day before Thanksgiving. So we will pick up we will pick up chapter 9 the following Wednesday.
December 4th.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.